In the last lectures, we learned how we can register controls and how we can submit the form and also which properties this form has. Now, right now, we submit the form by passing the form which we get via ngForm here to the onSubmit method. This is absolutely fine and probably the approach you will use in many use cases. I just want to bring some other approach to your attention. You don't have to submit it here. Remember the component section where we learned about add_viewChild, which allowed us to access a local reference, an element controlled or which holds a local reference in our TypeScript code? Well, in the end, we do just have such a local reference here. And whilst it might not point to an element ref, but to the ngForm object, it still is a local reference in our template. So we can also use add_viewChild here. So I will simply comment out this onSubmit method here so that we have it in the code you can find attached to this module and show you an alternative approach. In this alternative approach, I will use add_viewChild, this decorator you learned about in the components section, so make sure to import it from @AngularCore. And I want to get access to the element which has the local reference f on it. So I pass f as a string as an argument to viewChild, and then I could simply store this in a variable named signup_form, any name you like, which will be of type ngForm, of course. Now in onSubmit, I could output this signup_form like this. And you should see that if I now submit this again, we still have this form. And I can also enter something so that we can see that this works too if we have a look at the value. So this gives us access to the very same form without passing it to onSubmit. This is especially useful if you need to access the form not just at the point of time when you submit it, but also earlier. And I will show a use case for this in a later lecture. For now, let's keep in mind that this is another way of getting access to the form in our TypeScript code, a perfectly valid way of getting access. And before diving deeper into why this might be useful or when we could use that, let's actually understand how we can control the validity of the form. So to determine whether the form is valid, if we enter the valid email address here or not. Because right now I can submit anything, no matter if this is invalid, if this is empty. It would be nice if you could add such validation and take advantage of the tools Angular gives us there to possibly also enhance the user experience by placing a red border around invalid elements or something like this. We'll have a look at validation in the next lectures. So as mentioned at the end of the last lecture, would be nice if we could validate the user input, something very important in any app you build. Whilst you should still validate input on the server, as the frontend can always be tricked, you can greatly enhance user experience by also validating the input here. For example, we want to make sure that none of the fields here is empty and that the email address actually is a valid email address. So let's go back to our app component, to the HTML file, to the template, and see how we can add such validators. Now, since we use the template-driven approach, we can only add them in the template. And here we can, for example, add required to our username input. Now, required is a default HTML attribute you can add to an input. Here, however, Angular will detect it, so it acts as a selector for a built-in directive shipping with Angular, and it will automatically configure your form, you could say, to take this into account to make sure that now this will be treated as invalid if, well, it is empty. And on the email, we can, for example, therefore also add required, and there also is an email directive you can add. Now, email is not a built-in HTML attribute, it still is a directive, and keep in mind, required is only treated as a selector for an Angular directive here. An email is simply another directive made available by Angular, which makes sure that this is actually a valid email address. So now if we save this, and we have a look at our form here and I submit it. I can still submit it because we haven't set up anything which would prevent us from doing so. But if we have a look at it and check the valid attribute, you see it as false. And if I enter something here, so it's filled, but the email address is still not valid, you see that still valid is false. Only if I turn this into a valid email address here, only in this case, now if we submit it, now you see valid is true. So now Angular tracks the state of this form and correctly informs us or gives us a chance of querying it whether this form is valid or not. And actually this does not only work on form level. If we dive into the actual controls, you see that on the email control, we also have a valid attribute, which is true. So it tracks this on a per control level and then also on a form level. Now, there also is another place where it tracks this and helps us. If we inspect this email element here in the HTML code, you see that it adds a couple of classes because the form control class here is by us. It's a bootstrap class to give it some styling. But ngDirty, ngTouched, and ngValid, these are not classes added by us, and the ng at the beginning makes it pretty clear who is responsible for adding these classes. Now watch these classes if I remove the @ sign here. You saw that ngInvalid was added and ngValid was removed. So Angular dynamically adds some classes giving us information, some CSS classes, giving us information about the state of the individual control here. Whether it is dirty or not, so whether we did change the initial value, whether it is touched or not, so whether we clicked into it or not, and whether it is valid or not. Now with that information, we can style these inputs conditionally. So let's in the next lecture take advantage of the fact that Angular tracks the state of the validity and of the form overall and change the styling and the behavior, the user experience with that form. In the last lecture, we found out that Angular tracks the state of each control of the form, whether it's valid and so on, and conditionally also adds these CSS classes. Now with that information, we can go back to our form and you take advantage of it. Before diving into these CSS classes, the easiest way of taking advantage is down here on the Submit button. Let's disable the button if the form is not valid. So I'll just split this over multiple lines and add some property binding. I want to bind to the disabled property, which will set the disabled state of this button to true or false depending on some condition, and I will specify the condition here. Now I could say true here to always disable it. That of course is not super useful. Instead here I want to check whether the form, remember we do have access to it on this f local reference here. So if this form is valid, or to be precise, if it is not valid. So if this form is not valid, the button should be disabled. And we can actually see this once this reloads that now the button is disabled, and only if I enter some valid values here, I can hit the submit button again. So this is the first improvement in place. The second improvement is to take advantage of these CSS classes. We do get these classes added automatically. So we can now go to the style sheet of this app component, and we could say that on ngInvalid, we want to give it a red border. So 1 pixel solid red. Sounds like a solid idea, doesn't it? Well, if we do this, you see everything is red now. The two controls, but also the overall form. The reason for this is that our overall form is also invalid, and that Angular also adds the ngInvalid class, CSS class, to the form element. So a better approach would be to make sure that it is not added to the form. Now there are a couple of ways of doing this, and it's all just pure CSS logic. One idea would be that we want to be inside of the form element, but then it would still place these red borders around grouping divs. We will have a look at what I mean with this later. So the best way is to simply be explicit that we want to add it on inputs, for example. And of course, you could also add select here, so input with ngInvalid or select with ngInvalid and which other elements you have. Just be creative here. There are different ways of achieving this goal. In the end, you just want to make sure that the border is applied to the right controls. Now with this in place, we see that now we only have a red border around the invalid controls, but we do have the border right from the start, which is also not great because I at least want to give the user the chance of changing it before showing a warning, showing that it's wrong. So a better approach might be to make sure that we only add a red border to an input which has the CSS class ng invalid and also the CSS class ng touched, so that the user has to at least click into it. Now by default, we don't see anything red, even though the form is invalid. But if you click in there and decide, yeah, I'm done, this is my value, well, now you see we have a red border because now we had a chance of changing it, we didn't change it, it is invalid, and we want to show this. And with that, we're taking advantage of this form state handled by Angular. We disable the button and we show a visual feedback to the user. Now you could of course go much further. You could also add a warning message below this input here, for example, and output, please enter a valid value, or be more precise than that of course, and add ngIf to conditionally show this if the input value is wrong. Well, this gives us one additional problem though. How do we determine whether this input here or this control here does hold a wrong value? We'll take a closer look in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we improved the user experience by taking advantage of the form state handled by Angular. Now let's improve this even more, and let's say we want to output some help text below this input to assist if there is an invalid value in there. Now we can use a Bootstrap class here, help block, to make sure that this has the appropriate styling, and then we could say please enter a valid email. We only want to show this if if an invalid value has been entered into the control associated with this input though. Well, a quick and easy way of getting access to the control created by Angular automatically as we added ngModel to the input is by adding a local reference to this input element here, for example email, any name you like, and associating this now not with ngForm as we did for the overall form, but with ngModel. So just like the form directive automatically added by Angular when it detects a form element, the ngModel directive here also kind of exposes some additional information about the control it creates for us on the overarching form by accessing ngModel. So with this, we could simply check or say that we want to attach this span here if email is not valid, so add exclamation mark at the beginning. Now with this, if this reloads, you see that help text, and of course you can improve this by also chaining another condition that the email should have been touched to give the user a chance of changing it. So now you don't see the warning, but if you click in there and click out of there and it is invalid, you see that warning, and if you now enter valid data, it disappears. So this is another way of taking advantage of the state managed by Angular, but this also shows you how you can get a quick and easy access to control added by Angular. And with that, you should have the tools to really provide a pleasant user experience, showing the right errors, the right warnings, and styling the form correctly depending on the state of the form.